New York City, the Plaza Hotel. The golden ballroom glittered under crystal chandeliers as the deal of the century was being finalized. Carlos Mendoza, 62 years old, worth $4 billion, was about to sign the contract that would sell his pharmaceutical company to the Chinese. The $50,000 Mont Blanc pen was suspended over the document when Carmen, 24 years old, waitress for 6 months, leaned over to serve the champagne and whispered. Page 47, Clause 12b. They mistranslated it. You lose everything, not just the company. Carlos looked at her shocked. How could a waitress read Mandarin? Carmen continued in perfect Chinese. Your interpreter is paid by them. They're scamming you. Silence fell over the room. Carlos put down the pen, took the contract, went to page 47. His face paled, he stood up. He tore the document in front of everyone. Then he did something no one expected. He knelt before the waitress. Who are you? He asked. Carmen. She removed her apron. I'm the daughter of Miguel Ruiz, the man you ruined 10 years ago, and today I saved your life. What city are you watching this video from and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The Plaza Hotel emanated opulence from every pore of marble and velvet that November night, in the grand ballroom reserved for the occasion. What the financial newspapers would define as the deal of the decade was being finalized, the sale of Mendoza Pharmaceuticals to Shanghai Medical Group for $8 billion. Carlos Mendoza was seated at the head like a Castilian emperor, his silver hair perfectly combed, the custom-made tuxedo that concealed his 62 years, carried with the arrogance of someone who has never lost. Around him, lawyers, notaries, consultants, and the Chinese delegation led by Shang Wei, a man who smiled too much, to be honest. Carmen Alvarez had been serving in that room for 6 months, but that night was different. She had studied every detail for weeks, intercepted conversations, photographed documents carelessly left on tables. She wasn't there by chance. She was there for a plan she had architected for 3 years since she discovered who her father really was and what Carlos Mendoza had done to him. The young woman moved between tables with studied grace, serving Krug Grand Cuvée in Baccarat crystal glasses. No one really noticed her. She was part of the decor, like the silk curtains or the paintings on the walls. But Carmen observed everything. The poorly disguised nervousness of Shang Wei's Spanish interpreter, the way Chinese lawyers exchanged glances when certain passages were translated. Mendoza's arrogant confidence, who hadn't even deigned to have the contract reviewed by an independent Mandarin expert. The contract was a 200-page tome, drafted in Spanish, English, and Mandarin. The legally binding version was the Mandarin one, a detail that Mendoza had accepted with smugness, trusting his personal interpreter, Dr. Joaquin Herrera, esteemed university professor with 30 years of experience. What Mendoza didn't know was that Herrera had gambling debts of $300,000 that Shang Wei had kindly settled a week earlier. Carmen had studied Mandarin for 4 years at university, perfecting it with a year in Beijing. No one at the plaza knew. Her resume only said hospitality school diploma. It was part of the cover, part of the long plan to reach this moment. While serving, her eyes scanned the pages of the contract open in front of Mendoza. Most of it was standard, boring commercial jargon, but on page 47, buried among apparently innocuous clauses about intellectual property, was the bomb. Clause 12b in Spanish spoke of transfer of patents currently in development. In Mandarin, the same clause included all personal and corporate assets of the seller as collateral guarantee in case of future contractual disputes. In practice, if any controversy arose, even pretextual, Shang Wei could take everything, not just the company, but Mendoza's personal properties, bank accounts, everything. Carmen felt her heart race. The moment had arrived. Mendoza had taken his Mont Blanc, gift from the Chinese government for the occasion inlaid with jade and gold. He was unscrewing it with theatrical gestures, enjoying the moment of his triumph. $8 billion for a company worth half. Or at least that's what he believed. She approached with the champagne bottle, pretending to need to fill Mendoza's glass. She leaned over, and in the movement her breath brushed the millionaire's ear. The words came out in a barely perceptible whisper, in perfect Spanish, but with a trace of accent that wasn't hers. Mendoza tensed. He looked at her for the first time, really, seeing not a waitress, but a young woman with eyes of intelligence sharp as a razor. Carmen continued in fluent Mandarin, knowing that no one but she and the Chinese would understand. But the tone was unmistakable. An urgent warning. Mendoza's face went from the pink of triumph to the white of terror in 3 seconds. He took the contract with hands that now trembled slightly, flipped to page 47, called Herrera, asked him to translate clause 12b word for word. Herrera stammered, sweated. In the end, he collapsed, confessing there were some interpretative discrepancies. The room erupted in chaos. Mendoza stood up with a violence that knocked over the champagne glass onto the contract, staining with gold pages valued at billions. He took the document, and with theatrical gestures tore it into 100 pieces that he made rain over the Chinese delegation like poisoned confetti. Shang Wei protested, threatened with lawsuits, spoke of binding preliminary agreements, but Mendoza had recorded Herrera's confession on his phone. The fraud attempt was evident. The Chinese delegation was escorted out by hotel security, while Shang Wei shouted threats in Mandarin that Carmen mentally translated, and that made her shudder. When the room emptied, only Mendoza and Carmen remained. She was picking up broken glasses, pretending to have returned to her role as waitress. Mendoza stopped her with a gesture. He looked at her for a long time, studying her like one studies an enigma. Carmen straightened. She removed her apron with slow and deliberate gestures. When she spoke, her voice no longer had a trace of servility. It was clear, cultured, cutting. She pronounced the name she had kept silent for years. She was Carmen Ruiz, daughter of Miguel Ruiz, the researcher who 10 years earlier had developed the drug that had made Mendoza a millionaire. The drug that Mendoza had stolen by having Miguel fired with false accusations of industrial espionage, destroying his reputation so completely that he had committed suicide a year later. The silence that followed was dense as molasses. Mendoza looked at her as if seeing a ghost. Carmen had her father's face, the same green eyes, the same determination that had made Miguel the best researcher Mendoza, pharmaceuticals had ever had, and that had signed his condemnation when he refused to cede the rights to his discoveries for a pittance. The presidential suite of the Plaza Hotel was a 1,400-square-foot apartment where Mendoza had established his New York headquarters. Carmen was sitting on the blue velvet sofa, categorically refusing to be intimidated by the luxury surrounding her. Mendoza had served 2 glasses of Japanese whiskey at $3,000 a bottle, but neither was drinking. The story Carmen told that night was a masterpiece of planning and patience. After her father's suicide, when she was only 14, she was raised by her grandmother in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. She had seen her mother fade day by day, die of grief 2 years after Miguel. At 18, alone in the world, she had sworn revenge, but not a revenge of blood, a revenge of justice. She had studied languages at university, specializing in Mandarin. When she discovered Mendoza was expanding business in China, she had learned everything about him, his habits, his vices, his arrogance, which made him blind to details. She knew he dined at the plaza every Tuesday, that he preferred to be served by young and pretty waitresses whom he never really looked in the face, that his hubris would lead him to trust a corrupt interpreter. The plan was simple in its complexity. Infiltrate his world like an invisible but present ghost. Wait for the right moment, and when that moment came, save him. Yes, save him. Because Carmen's revenge wasn't to destroy him. It was to prove to him that the daughter of the man he had destroyed was worth more than all his billions. Mendoza listened in silence, his face an unreadable mask. When Carmen finished, he stood up and went to the safe hidden behind a Velázquez painting. He extracted a folder that he threw on the crystal table in front of her. Inside were documents, photos, recordings, the proof that Miguel Ruiz hadn't stolen anything, that the accusations had been fabricated, that Mendoza knew he was innocent, but had destroyed him anyway because he refused to sell him the patents. Carmen looked at the documents with trembling hands. After 10 years, the proof of her father's innocence was there in front of her. She raised her eyes to Mendoza and for the first time saw not an industry titan, but an old and tired man. Mendoza confessed that night things he had never told anyone, how success had made him ruthless, how he had justified every crime with the excuse of business, how Miguel's death haunted him, especially after learning of the suicide. He had kept those documents as a kind of penance, knowing that one day someone would come to claim justice, but he didn't expect it would be Miguel's daughter who would save him from himself. The Chinese contract was a perfect trap. If Carmen hadn't warned him, he would have lost everything. The company, the properties, the secret accounts in Switzerland. Shangwei had been planning for years, corrupting Herrera, preparing a network of pretextual lawsuits that would be activated as soon as the contract was signed. In 6 months, Carlos Mendoza would have been a beggar. Carmen had had her revenge served on a silver platter. She only needed to stay silent and watch the man who had destroyed her father lose everything. Instead, she chose to save him, because she said, looking him in the eyes, her father had taught her that integrity is worth more than revenge, that saving even your worst enemy makes you better than him. The sun was rising over New York City when Mendoza made his proposal. He wasn't a man used to asking forgiveness or repairing his mistakes, but that night he had seen the abyss, and a 24-year-old woman had pulled him back. He offered her everything: money, properties, a position in the company. Carmen rejected everything with a bitter smile. She didn't want his charity. Then, Mendoza proposed something different. The Miguel Ruiz Foundation for Medical Research, financed with $100 million Carmen in management, with absolute power over how to use the funds and, above all, the posthumous publication of all of Miguel's research, with his name as principal author, giving him back the credit that had been stolen from him. Carmen hesitated. It was more than she had expected, but less than her father deserved. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. She added her conditions. Mendoza had to confess publicly what he had done, apologize at Miguel's grave, and hire all the researchers who had been fired along with her father if they were still alive and available. The public confession would destroy Mendoza's reputation. His stocks would plummet. Partners would abandon him. It was a very high price. But while looking at Carmen, Mendoza saw in her something he had lost long ago: absolute, incorruptible integrity, and understood it was a price he had to pay. The press conference was organized for the following week. The press room at Mendoza Pharmaceuticals was packed with journalists. Mendoza read a statement prepared by Carmen, each word a stab to his legacy. He confessed the fraud against Miguel Ruiz, the false accusations, the theft of intellectual property. He announced the foundation, the restitution of credits, the repertory hirings. The market reacted as expected. Stocks fell 40% in one day. Historic partners rescinded contracts. But something unexpected also happened. Young researchers, attracted by the redemption story and the new ethical direction promised by Carmen, began sending resumes. Ethical investors, those Mendoza had always despised, began buying stocks. In 6 months, the company had been transformed and, surprisingly, was stronger than before. Carmen had taken possession of an office on the top floor of Mendoza Tower, right next to Carlos's, not as his employee but as his conscience. Every important decision now passed through her ethical filter. At first, it was pure tension, two enemies forced to collaborate. But over time, something changed. 3 months after the confession, Carmen discovered something that changed everything. She was reviewing old documents from her father when she found a letter never sent, dated a week before his suicide. It was addressed to Mendoza, but it wasn't a letter of accusations. It was a warning. Miguel had discovered that someone inside the company was selling secrets to the Chinese. The same ones who had now tried to buy everything. He had tried to warn Mendoza, but was fired before he could. The real traitor was still in the company, in a position of power, waiting for the right moment to attack. Carmen brought the letter to Mendoza that same night. Together, they initiated a secret investigation that took them to the darkest corners of the company. What they discovered was shocking. A corruption network involving the CFO, the legal director, and even the head of security. Shangwei was just the tip of the iceberg. The plan to destroy Mendoza had been underway for a decade, orchestrated by someone who wanted revenge for reasons neither of them could imagine. Working together, Carmen and Mendoza became a formidable team. She brought the analytical intelligence of her father and a knowledge of languages that allowed deciphering intercepted communications. He brought the experience of 40 years of corporate battles and a network of contacts that reached the most unthinkable places. The night they identified the real mastermind, both were speechless. It was Isabel Herrera, the corrupt interpreter's wife, but above all the daughter of Antonio Mendoza, Carlos's brother who died 20 years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Isabel believed Carlos had killed her father to take total control of the family company. She had dedicated her life to destroying him from within. The confrontation with Isabel was dramatic. Summoned to Mendoza's office under the pretext of discussing her husband's case, she found herself facing Carmen and Carlos united with crushing evidence of her conspiracy, but instead of rage, Isabel broke down in tears. She told her version. Her father dying of a heart attack after a violent fight with Carlos, the veiled threats to silence her, the 20 years of planning for revenge. Carlos, for the first time in his life, showed true vulnerability. He confessed the fight had occurred, violent and cruel, but that Antonio had died hours later from a heart attack caused by a congenital heart malformation no one knew about. He had covered up the fight to protect the company from scandal without realizing he was feeding Isabel's suspicions. Carmen found herself in the middle of two intertwined family tragedies, two revenges that fed each other and did something no one expected. She proposed a pact. Instead of destroying each other, they would use the truth to rebuild. Isabel would confess her role in the conspiracy in exchange for immunity. Carlos would open all files about Antonio's death, and together they would clean the company of the corruption that had infested it. The company cleanup process lasted 6 months. 12 executives were fired, some arrested. Shang Wei and his organization were exposed to international authorities, but the real transformation was deeper. Carmen had implemented rigorous ethical protocols, transforming Mendoza Pharmaceuticals into a model of corporate transparency. The Miguel Ruiz Foundation had already produced 2 revolutionary patents for low-cost drugs for rare diseases. The company, against all odds, prospered. 2 years after that night at the Plaza Hotel, the Grand Ballroom hosted a very different event, the launch of drug MRC1 by the initials of Miguel Ruiz and Carmen, which promised to revolutionize the treatment of triple-negative breast cancer. The drug would be sold at cost price in developing countries, a decision Carmen had imposed, and that Mendoza had accepted with surprising enthusiasm. The room was filled with researchers, doctors, cancer survivors, and journalists, but at the main table only 3 people were seated: Carmen, Carlos, and Isabel, now administrator of the foundation, 3 people united by tragedies and revenges who had chosen redemption over destruction. Carlos stood up for the speech. At 64, he looked rejuvenated. He spoke of Miguel Ruiz as the greatest researcher he had ever known, of how his involuntary sacrifice had saved not only the company, but all their souls. He spoke of Carmen as the daughter he never had, of the conscience that had given him back a humanity he thought lost. Carmen took the floor after him. She told the complete story publicly for the first time: the plan to infiltrate as a waitress, the discovery of the Chinese fraud, the choice to save the man who had destroyed her father. But above all, she spoke of forgiveness, not as weakness, but as the greatest strength a human being can show. As she spoke, her eyes fell on a table at the back of the room. There was a young waitress serving champagne, a girl with intelligent eyes who observed everything with suspicious attention. Carmen smiled at her, remembering herself 2 years before. The girl returned the smile, then went back to her work, invisible but present. After the event, as the room emptied, Carlos handed Carmen an envelope. Inside were legal documents naming her his universal heir, not just of the company, but of everything. Carmen began to protest, but Carlos stopped her. He had no family, he said. His parents had died. He had never married. He had no children. Carmen was the closest thing to a daughter he would ever have, not by blood, but by choice. But Carmen had a counter-proposal. She would accept the inheritance with one condition. Half would go to the foundation, a quarter to Isabel to repair past grievances, and only a quarter for herself. And when the time came, she would transform the entire company into a non-profit foundation, dedicated to accessible medical research. Carlos laughed, a true laugh he hadn't had in years. He accepted knowing it was the right decision. The empire he had built on cruelty would become a beacon of hope, and the daughter of the man he had destroyed would be its guardian. 1 year later, Carlos Mendoza died in his sleep peacefully. At his funeral, thousands of people came to pay tribute not to the ruthless businessman he had been, but to the man who had found redemption in the last years of his life. Carmen spoke at the funeral, calling him not her redeemed enemy, but her unexpected mentor, the man who had taught her that even the darkest souls can find the light if someone is willing to show it to them. The Mendoza Ruiz Foundation, as it was renamed, became in the following decades the largest non-profit medical research organization in the world. Carmen directed it for 40 years, developing cures for diseases that Big Pharma ignored because they weren't profitable. She married a researcher she met at the foundation. She had 3 children who grew up in the laboratories among test tubes and microscopes. But every year, on November 15th, anniversary of that night at the Plaza Hotel, Carmen returned to the grand ballroom. Now she was the one sitting at the main table, surrounded by young researchers full of hope, and every year she made sure to be served by a young waitress, to whom she always left an exorbitant tip and a note that said, "Everyone has a story. What's yours?" Because she had learned that the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemy, but transforming them into an ally. That forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but builds a better future. And that sometimes a waitress who whispers a warning can change not only a millionaire's destiny, but the course of medical history. The last scene New York City remembers from this story is simple, but powerful. A laboratory full of young researchers from all nationalities working under the portrait of Miguel Ruiz. Next to it, a portrait of Carlos Mendoza, not as the ruthless titan he had been, but as the man who had found redemption. And in the center, a plaque with Carmen's words. From revenge, only more revenge is born. From forgiveness is born the future. The Plaza Hotel continues to host gala dinners and million-dollar deals. The grand ballroom continues to shine under its crystal chandeliers. But for those who know the story, it's no longer just a banquet hall. It's the place where a waitress saved her worst enemy, and saving him saved herself, and thousands of future lives. And somewhere, at this moment, in some luxurious ballroom in the world, a waitress is serving champagne to a powerful person who doesn't see her. But she's watching, she's waiting. She's deciding whether to be the angel of revenge or of redemption. And in that choice, in that moment suspended between hate and forgiveness, lies the power to change the world. Because Carmen Ruiz proved you don't need to be rich or powerful to alter the course of destiny. You just need to be in the right place, at the right time, with the courage to whisper the truth in the ear of power. And sometimes, just sometimes, that whisper can become a shout that awakens the sleeping conscience of the world. If this story has touched your heart, like, if you believe forgiveness is stronger than revenge, comment. If you think even the worst enemy can become an ally, share. Because somewhere someone is planning revenge, and maybe this story will convince them to choose redemption.